Welcome to GameWell, the podcast about a thriving future in games, from well-being and creativity to optimization and performance.
Welcome to this episode of GameWell. Today I have Gary Simonds on, a neuroscience expert and a previously neurosurgeon that is now writing books, novels, a young adult novel that's in the makes, and much more. Welcome, Gary, and why don't you introduce yourself in case I've missed something?
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor. I spent most of my professional career in neurosurgery and practiced originally in the Army and then a couple of major trauma centers where I was the head of a neurosurgery department and residency training program for many years. But I put down the scalpel a few years ago, but continue to teach undergrads and medical students, predominantly in the Virginia Tech system over here in the States. And otherwise, as you say, I am doing a lot of writing and also as much time as I can get on my trusty guitar and banjo, and spending some great time in the outdoors in a wonderful corner of the world.
I want to kind of zoom into you playing the guitar and the banjo, because I know there's some really interesting stuff to talk about from the brain perspective in terms of aging and also what music in general can offer, both from a psychological and neuroscientific perspective. Is there anything you want to elaborate on in that area?
Oh, geez, you can take that almost as deep as you want. I would tend to get more anecdotal in some ways, in that, at least for me, it's always been a kind of a refuge. The neurosurgical world is a crazy place. As a matter of fact, my novel that came out this year, really, I tried to give a real glimpse behind the curtains of what a crazy place it is. It's kind of a mile a minute. Crises are happening everywhere. There's a lot of lost sleep, a lot of worry, a lot of concern and all. And, to keep your mental health, I think you need an escape, period. And it's interesting because um, I thrived in that atmosphere. I think I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. And so, being interrupted every few minutes by an emergency and somebody dying or somebody going paralyzed, in many ways, like I said, I kind of thrived in that. Whereas I know, plenty of partners hated the inconsistency and the unpredictability. And yet, at some point, you've got to give your mind, your body, your psyche a break. And for me, it really worked to get on a musical instrument like the guitar and banjo. Oddly enough, it may be hard to believe for those who have been around banjos much, but I'd start playing and I would drift off to sleep as I was playing. And I think it was a sign of just kind of how meditative it was, how soothing it was, because it's hard to fall asleep around a banjo. So yeah, on one level, I can tell you just a real Zen type of experience potentially. I think if you want to get into the neuroscience of music, it's fascinating. There's a lot of, I haven't really kept up on it recently, but there's a lot of research going on into it out there. And there was a book several years ago that came out. It was called "This Is Your Music on Brain." This is your brain on music. And I really recommend it to almost anyone. It's a fascinating book by a neuroscientist who's really studied how our brain picks apart music, because you begin to realize there's a lot of elements to music, and it appeals and registers with various areas of our brains. So on that front, there's it can be fascinating and just fun, and it's a great book. I think it's pretty understandable. It wasn't written for neurosurgeons. It was written for, the lay public. And then, as you were touching on, and forgive me for rambling, but I'm just giving you the few pieces that
No,
we
please do.
may want. But we know on multiple fronts, on multiple levels, in terms of brain health, keeping a brain engaged and keeping a brain kind of learning new things and experiencing new things is super healthy for it. And, for example, if you look into the world of dementia, people who keep, putting their mind into action, learning new languages, reading, learning, going to classes, that sort of thing, that seems to be somewhat protective against dementia. Nothing's a perfect immunity to it, but it seems to help. And I think anytime you're doing music, it would be similar, where you're learning a new language. It's just a musical language, and super healthy for the brain.
I see a lot of parallels as well. My son, he's 2 years old right now, and there's just a unique aspect to the way that I see his brain and consciousness reacting to nursery rhymes in terms of playfulness, interaction, coding of information within the music, etc. There's just and I had this realization very recently, a few days ago, where he's starting to really digest things easier through the medium of lyrics and interaction and play in a way. And I think music does this very uniquely, where there is an easy way for you to have a new creative input where you change it slightly and make it uniquely yours. So the brain learns new things in this way, but you're also encoding it melodically and playing it out with your body and interacting with the people around you in a unique way. And I think it also speaks to why societies in general always have had music and music gatherings in a way. So I think there's so many layers, as you say, to the benefits of music. And I think we could unpack this in any direction that we want, to the point where music, am I correct in saying that music, and I don't know if you're up to date with the studies there, but am I correct in saying that it also has a mood effect? I know that binaural beats definitely have an effect on the brain in one way or another, contra not listening to it. So I just want to pass it back to you. What's your experience, or what are you hearing, seeing, reading, knowing about this?
Yeah, I have no question that it affects mood. Again, when you really dissect it out, it affects all areas of the brain, depending on the various components of it. So no shock that it gets into the mood systems as well. Mood, reward systems, that sort of things. So why it does, how we evolved, that it's so important, I think would be another fascinating study, and probably one of the many things I would like to read more about when I finally get a little bit more time, because I think that's fascinating, right? Just how it somehow got so incorporated into being human. As you say, I don't think we can find a society where it's not an important component of it.
For sure. I mean, it allows for a lot of information to travel as well, right? There's so many layers: mood, collection of information, expression of self, expression of groups, etc., etc. So I think it's definitely a very interesting field that one can pursue.
I'll tell you this too, Kevin. So back quite a few years ago now, when I was in one medical center, and it was actually a big medical center in a very small town, and the town itself therefore didn't really have much to offer other than natural beauty. And a group of friends of mine and I were actually soccer players. We were playing adult soccer, and we found out that several of us played musical instruments. So we started a band, and bunch of 40-year-olds in a garage band. And I got to tell you, when we were terrible. I don't think we ever got all that good. But when you would start playing together and things would start to sync up, it was probably one of the most euphoric feelings I've ever had. And, you want to talk again, get into the neuroscience. I mean, it was definitely tapping into the reward systems and the dopamine systems and all that, release of, I'm sure, endogenous opioids and cannabinoids and stuff as we were doing it. Just one of the most pleasurable experiences, particularly when it, like I said, when it's synced up. So it has, that effect. I think it therefore has society building effect as well, where, you're linking amongst other people in your groups, building groups and all. Really, truly magical stuff.
Yeah, we see it. We see it with pop music as well, right? It's a medium to connect people around the globe these days. Where pop music from Korea starts to influence culture around the world. So there's definitely a medium there. Gary, I have a question to you, and I think it's a little bit regarding creation in general, but I want to uniquely put it in your perspective and how you do it, because the audience is always engaged with creation in one way or another. So you, as a neurosurgeon and understanding the brain and the way you do, how has that affected the way that you approach creating your books, planning, executing, writing them? Like, how does your knowledge of the brain influence the way that you go on about creating an experience for other individuals?
Oh, geez. I'm not sure that I necessarily link the two, but there is a correlate at least, and that is, through most of my career, I was explaining this to somebody the other day. In medicine, you actually write a lot. You write all the time because you're always recording what you're doing for patients. We get into the scientific journals as well and doing this and doing that. Anyway, you're writing all the time. And then I got into the world of burnout in healthcare workers and ended up writing 3 books on it as well. But it's all nonfiction. Everything you do is nonfiction. As a matter of fact, in terms of the medical writing, you better make it as nonfiction as possible, right? Because, you may be in a court of law at some point defending what you wrote or something. But one way or the other, it's nonfiction, and it began. As a matter of fact, this novel that I brought out this year, it originally was a nonfiction book. I really wanted to give a good picture of what modern medicine, modern neurosurgery looks like. What the days look like, what the operations look like, how patients get into the trouble that they get into, and I started writing it. I just felt like I was back in school doing a book report. It just felt so kind of restrictive and boring, and I was bored. So I decided, well, maybe if I put it into a novel form, a fictional form, it might be able. I might be able to do the same thing, really give a good glimpse into our world, but it might be much more immersive for the reader, where they feel like they're there in the operating room and they feel like they're trying to stop bleeding in the brain, as opposed to me talking about how it feels. Well, anyway, that was the idea. So I sat down and started writing. Talk about, I mean, it felt like an explosion. I mean, it just was so liberating that as a matter of fact, I call it verbal dysentery. I just couldn't stop writing, and the book came out 2.5 times its eventual length because I just couldn't stop writing. New subplots were going on, new characters, all that sort of thing. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is, I think I felt the creativity side of me forever was so restricted that once you took those restraints off, it went out in all directions. Now, that may not be the most constructive way. I guess sometimes we need guidelines and we need, navigational beacons and stuff like that. But I think it was certainly very healthy for my brain, at least, and I would imagine for a lot of people who particularly are, who are often very restrained all the time, some way to find a creative outlet, because I think we all have creative beings within us. And so I think it's super healthy to give an outlet. And like I said, for me, I couldn't stop writing. I would sit down. My poor wife, part of me stopping the neurosurgery was I was going to be around more than I used to be. And I would sit down at the breakfast table and start writing, and I'd look up and it's dinner time. It's 6 o'clock at night, and so I don't know if that answers your question, but it definitely, on a personal level, to all of a sudden have the opportunity to be creative was an amazing experience.
I'm trying to process what you said. I was asking for a thing that I thought I wanted to know, but instead I've gotten something different, which is also very valuable. But I want to try to summarize what you said, or what I heard you say at least. So, in a way, what I heard without you saying it is that you've had this creative process that has been kind of restricted with the bounds of needing to be very surgical, very precise. And then you got the liberating effect of being able to use the experience of your profession, which has been very fast paced, very intense, very instant feedback kind of situation. And then what I heard, and this is not something you said, this is me making meaning out of what you're saying, is in a way you've used the book to create a novel that is based on your experience. So you've almost used it as a psychological processing tool where you're decompressing your brain from all the experience that you've had that was very hectic, where you didn't have time to make meaning of it, and then putting it on paper in a fictionalized way. And I think, it's that's very, very interesting to do. And it's something that people can take away, that the intensity of your experiences, if you can find unique ways to integrate it into your work, especially in the work of creation, and layer descriptive elements of creating a emulated experience for another individual that they can use their empathy to experience, that's very powerful, because it feels real. And it feels tangible, and it's, if you manage to get the right words or the right experience or the right sequence onto it, then it creates something unique. And I guess what you're also saying is that you spent your time in flow, so you forgot all about time all the time.
Yeah, I wish I could say it as eloquently as you. I think you're hitting the nail on the head. I think my wife would very much agree with you that she believes that for me it was a way of processing all that had gone on through the years, because it is a crazy world, and there's much tragedy and much strife that you get through, but there's also just amazing examples of humanity and kindness and courage and grace.
Is there or are there any particular events or experiences you would like to share?
Oh yeah, I think with that book, I very much wanted, as I said, to kind of plumb that world, but I wanted to have a few messages come out of it if I could. I don't want to be too preachy, but one of the things that you are constantly exposed to is the concept of how fragile we all are, how fragile everything that we are experiencing is. We tend to take a lot for granted. We tend to get wound up about the simplest of things at times, because we have the luxury of doing so, right? Because we kind of recognize that we're probably not going to starve to death. We are probably going to, have food and shelter and all that. Um, but the reality is that life is super fragile. You just don't know. And in my world, it was shoved in your face every day. I talk about we would do these what we call because people get sick at night. So every third or fourth night we would be on call. Each individual would be on call waiting for emergencies to happen, and we might have anywhere from 15 to 25 emergencies that we're called in on, and not necessarily they didn't all have to go into the operating room, but I can tell you every single one was a massive event in that person's life and that person's family's life, and there was death and coma and paralysis and stuff like that happening to people who just a few minutes before were living their normal lives. So one of the things that's really important to me is that people recognize that and maybe give it some thought as to appreciating it. You're talking about your 2-year-old. Sometimes 2-year-olds can wear us down, but man, what a miracle they are! And to watch their brains develop, just as you were talking about, I'll tell you what's going on. They're putting insulation on their nerves and inside their brain, and that's what you're watching. It's a little miracle there, and I think just to stop and recognize periodically how fragile it can be, and not to live in fear of that, but to say, okay, this is good. Life is good. I want to celebrate it with everybody else. I got to tell you, it was just awe-inspiring. And people ask me, because the hours were long, it was hard work. They say, how would you do it for so long and kind of nonstop? And I think I always said the thing that really got me out of bed every day was almost it was amongst more the families often than the patients, because unfortunately sometimes the patients were in coma, but every day I would be dealing with families and working with families of people who were afflicted in one way or the other. And it never ceased to stun me how brave they were, how felt put together they were. And the only term I could use sometimes is it just felt like grace. It felt like grace washes over them and us. And it was awe-inspiring. And I was trying to get that out in the book as well, and obviously the patients as well, with amazing bravery and humanity and grace. And if I could get that concept out, because in the United States right now, it feels like we're at each other's throats. If you watch the news, it feels like everybody hates each other and we don't trust each other and all. And, throughout 40 years of doing this, I can't say I could probably count on one hand how many people were offensive or were crazy or something. The vast majority were as human as you could want them to be, and as they say, full of grace, full of courage.
What an experience all that must have been.
It is.
I want to circle back around the topic of burnout, because that must have been a very reoccurring theme in one direction or another in the healthcare system. No matter where you go, it seems like the demands are only getting higher, especially the longer you're getting on the job, even though people are getting sick and hurt as much as they've always had. But there's something to be said about people that are either thriving or struggling in a high demand environment. And the individuals working in the game development industry, they're more often than not familiar with the pressures of the profession itself, because they're writing and creating very interesting mediums that are hard to predict when they are concluded or done. It can be done to some extent with measuring, but it's just difficult because there's too many factors coming in. There's a lot of people that come together. And I think there's an interesting parallel to the profession that you've been working in, because there are a lot of different individuals that are kind of coming together to make something work. And that there is a lot of unpredictability in your field as well. So I think you have some very unique things you could share that might be beneficial for people working in the industry.
Yeah, Kevin, we focused obviously and pretty much entirely in our time on burnout in healthcare, because that's what we knew. And when I say we, I had a partner in crime on all this, really a world expert on physician burnout. He's a clinical psychologist. His name's Wayne Sotil over here in the States, and just really a fantastic person and expert on all this. But you're hitting some of the high notes already, and that is that first of all, it is not the world of burnout is not restricted to healthcare by any stretch of the imagination. I think modern life is a burnout cauldron. This information era, which is marvelous, it's fascinating, it's exciting. The fact that I have a computer in my pocket is just crazy. And yet what happens is we're bombarded nonstop with information, also with demands, also with interruptions. We're asked to multitask nonstop all day. So and the demands for production just keep going up. So everybody in the society, I think, is subjected to very similar stressors to what we would discuss when we were discussing healthcare workers. And the other point that you were making, and I think would fit with your audience, is that it seems to be an affliction, particularly of bright, energized, creative, driven, hardworking people, and usually the setup is a setup of high demand and low control, where the demand is always there. In fact, it's usually increasing, and the amount that we can the fact that things can spring out of nowhere and knock it all off kilter, definitely sets up stressors that our brains are responding to and may respond to it eventually with a burnout type scenario. So absolutely, I think there are easy parallels to draw.
So what would you tackle first, speaking of people that are working in this environment? I mean, there's different layers to this, right? There's something an individual can do for themselves, and there's systemic things that can be done. There are communicative, cultural things that can be done. Maybe we can explore some of the things that you're seeing and some of the literature that is suggesting one thing or another in these different levels.
Yeah, Kevin. So in our books that we wrote about this, the single biggest criticism was that the system is messed up. The system is failing. The system is making this harder for everybody. Why don't you fix that? And we said, gee, yeah, that would be nice. give us a magic wand and we will fix the system. So I think on one level, we have to acknowledge, just as you're pointing out, the systems we're working in, the overall culture, is a stress cauldron for all of us. But what we tried to do is tackle it on the individual level, saying, yes, it's great to joust these windmills. It's great to be, to get into advocacy. It's great to try to make some impact on it. But in the meantime, this is all wearing on each and every one of us as individuals. And therefore, can we tackle it on an individualistic level or on a micro environment level? We don't necessarily have to fix everything, but maybe if we can make the small micro environment around us somewhat better, that is going to work as well. Another key thing that we try to stress is burnout is not the sole province of work. We can burn out from home life as well, and we can burn out from our social activities and all that sort of thing as well. And the two go hand in hand. So if you're burning out at work, you're probably going to burn out at home. If you're burning out at home, you're probably going to burn out at work. And so they shouldn't be divorced from one another. But in the individual level, we eventually worked with, I don't know, on the order of 70, 80 strategies and techniques that we tried to put out for people to try. And we can talk about some of those, give a few examples. But there's a couple of key rules, I would say, to all this. So the way we wanted to tackle burnout was to build individuals what we term resilience. It's a common term here, meaning our ability to face stressors and not be injured by them, not to be taken down by them. In the ideal world, maybe even to grow from them, but at least not be injured. And of late, I've been kind of trying to draw in a strict line between that idea and something that surfaced several years ago and really caught fire for a while. And that's the idea of grit. And it got on everybody's lips in neurosurgery. I can tell you that. Oh, yeah. Grit's what we really want. We want people who just, lower their head and drive, and it doesn't matter what. We want grit. And I'm like, no, we don't want grit. We don't want people who are just fighting on the more they get injured, because the greater the injury, the less efficacious they become. Bad efficacy in medicine starts to have real impact, at least. And I would say so in every corner of our society. So anyway, resilience is our target. How do we build resilience? And the study of this that we based our work on came out of the idea of, okay, they say 50% of doctors are burning out at any one time. Well, what are the 50% who aren't burning out doing? And you had alluded to this. So what we really went with was trying to figure out what are some of the techniques that the people who are thriving are using. All right, that's a long-winded prequel here, but the first thing I would say, and I hope it would speak very much to your audience, because I can imagine, and you'll have to correct me what their lives are like, but I can imagine how they may submerge into their work and become very focused on their work and what they're trying to achieve, and that, glitches in the system that all of a sudden, wait a second, this isn't working. Now I got to get this figured out. Anyway, and intelligence, we call it self-compassion. And that is, we've got to take the time periodically to sit down and say, who the heck am I? What drives me? Where do I want to be? Where do I want to get to? What feeds my fires? What drags me down? What elates me? Who is stressing me out? What stresses me out? How do I react to those stressors? Is that reaction a good reaction, or is that a reaction that's not going to serve me well in the long term? So I think the first step is really to understand ourselves in this crazy world and all our responses, because if we really want to get into the neuroscience, back to the neuroscience, every one of our brains are different. And they're changing all the time, and they're changing, as different beings and different functionalities. So if we think one size fits all, we're going to be sorely disappointed. We've got to figure ourselves out and then hopefully start addressing it. I'm gonna pause there just because I threw a lot out. But does that make any sense?
It does, and I'm starting to smile a little bit because it's something that I've been saying for a long time, and also have practiced a lot. I guess it's an old concept that reemerges, interestingly enough, and it's shown in philosophy around the world, and it's coming up again now in modern science, where we have energy to provide, we have our energy to use in one way or another. But if you're not directing that energy based on who you are and where you want to go, then you're wasting that energy and you're burning out because you're putting the rocket fuel in a direction that you don't want to go. You're aiming for the moon, but you're shooting for a different planet, and then you're drifting through space, and you're burnt out, and then you're lost in space in a way. And I guess it maybe feels a little bit like that too, where you're feeling like you're suffocated and you can't muster any energy anymore. So yeah, continuously reflecting upon your values and your goals and aspirations, and putting the goal-directed system in a way where you can actually do the things that you want to do, and realize that hardship is coming your way. Different emotions are coming your way. But if you're learning how to tackle these emotions and have them without needing to be happy, without needing to be not angry, not sad, when you're learning to move through these phases of life but still keep the same direction, that's where you really become powerful and effective in creating things that are coming from your core, because you've made this decision. And it's nuanced because you're always influenced from your environment, your culture, the places that you're moving in. But I am guessing that's what you're saying, and that's what you've been finding. And so it's just coming back to me in this form. And the ancient Greeks have talked about this. The Chinese have talked about this with Kung Fu and everything. I'm an old Kung Fu practitioner, so this is something that comes back as well, where they talk about the Qi follows Yi. The energy follows the attention. And so if your attention is everywhere but not directed, then you're going to burn out.
Yeah, I think we are very simpatico. I often like the metaphor when I talk to people about burnout, of this concept that all of us have a bank or a store of energy within us, as whatever we want to call it, psychic energy, emotional energy, whatever we want to call it. The thing that gets us out of bed, gets us engaging, gets us doing our daily routines, and then hopefully beyond it. And what I would argue is every experience we have, and every thought that we have is either making a deposit in that bank or it's withdrawing in that, from that bank. And I would argue that a state of burnout is probably where we've just overdrawn, where trying to make further deposits just doesn't seem to be moving the needle because we're so overdrawn. And then I think a lot of us probably cycle on the edge, so that it's sometimes, we got plenty of energy, and other times we dip below it. So I don't think burnout is black and white. You either are or you aren't, and it's not a permanent state of being. I think we fluctuate in it for sure. And as you say, if we're not aligned with what our beings are driving us towards, well, everything's going to start to become a withdrawal, right? If we're not aligned. And then another thing that you were talking about is, we've recognized this for how long that we have to know ourselves, right? How long have we known this? And yet I can tell you, I counsel pre-medical and pre-healthcare students all the time. And one of the first things I talk to them about, because they eventually have to write these essays about, why they want to be a doctor, or why they want to be a PA, or why they want to be a therapist, whatever, for their applications. And I say, okay, well, probably the most powerful argument that you're going to make is to be able to explain who you are and why you believe that this person is going to be great at being a doctor or a PA or a physiotherapist or whatever. And I say, so who are you? And they are, struck dumb, meaning unable to speak. I don't mean stupid. They're very bright people, but they have been on this rocket sled of achievement, and they have never stopped to think. It's just get to the goal, get to the goal, get to the goal. Again, I could see your audience being in a similar situation that it's very goal oriented. You got to get these things accomplished. You got to work out the glitches, and you just don't ever give it a chance to figure out, well, where am I in all this?
Absolutely. And I guess, this is the angle of looking at it from the individual, and it's probably the thing that is the fastest to set in motion, because
Yes.
you have control over yourself. So you can do it today, you can do it after you finish this podcast, or stop the podcast and do it now, right? It doesn't really matter.
Yes.
You can go and reflect upon things. And I think the solution is often to stop and reflect and ask questions to yourself and to things and to people, and then take an action rather than reacting. Because of what I'm seeing out there and what I'm seeing myself do, and when I'm not in this position, is that my biological drivers of survival are informing my actions, and they're masqueraded in a multitude of information, which is driving me to do more, consuming more information, doing more action, doing more work, doing more things. But if I'm not stopping and being mindful, and this is the area of mindfulness, right? But it's nothing more than that, than having awareness in the moment. And you can make it fluffy and big and make it a big thing you want to sell, or you can say, no, stop, look, question, analyze, take a new action that's directed, and it might not be right, but still it's more informed, so you're going in the right direction. So I think that's the layer of the individual, right, which we can start right now. And I really suggest everyone does that if they haven't done that recently or frequently in the past. But I also think that we can't look at the problem just in an isolated individual way. Although it has a big impact, I think we need to go from bottom up and top down and in the middle as well. Where when you're making small changes on all levels, what you're doing is you're creating compound effects on all levels. And then that's just going to make the system change over time. And I think that is also what culture does, is when the individuals start to change and the system starts to change together with with the individuals, that is what drives real change over time. And you can't say, well, I need to change the whole system and this is how it needs to work. No, you need to create compound effects in all layers, in the top layer, in the bottom layer, and the center layer, right? And the center is where they kind of coexist. But I'm rambling here, but what I would just want to say is, well, the system is going to work better if you know yourself better. But if the system doesn't allow for the individual to go through it and move through it because the conditions are not set, the system is there to serve the individual. So both things need to happen simultaneously so we can operate in it, right? I'm not sure if you agree with that or if you have a different angle to this.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, you hit so many important notes there. First thing, I guess, I think we have to recognize is if we're in some sort of system, even at the leadership level, at the very top, they're probably struggling with burnout too. And again, some self-reflection might go a long way, where you start thinking, geez, I'm subjecting my entire organization to this environment. So on so many levels, we may be able to help ourselves. And as you say, the more it begins to interdigitate, you create a tapestry, hopefully, of greater mental health and overall health for sure. But let me just react to a few things that you mentioned, because I think they're really important. So in our books, one of the things that we thought was most important, we talked about various stressors, and then we gave some, practical mechanisms of maybe dealing with these stressors. But what we thought was the most important parts in the books was a series of questions. Each time we had talked about a stressor, we would put out a series of questions for people to just think about, just exactly what you said, to just plant that seed and encourage people to work it over in their minds. And I think going with questions often is one of the ways to open oneself up, open one's mind to this more mindful state that you're talking about. To the point where one of the exercises that I frequently throw out there is for people just to get online, punch in Google personality tests or free personality tests. And we say, go ahead and take a few. Not for the final rating that you get, but for the questions that it asks as it goes through. And think about those questions and what it asks of you, and see if it brings a better understanding of yourself. You don't need the summary, and you can think about the summary and see if you think it fits. But more often than not, I think the questions are really the most helpful component of that. Then another thing that you hit upon, and it's actually one of our techniques or strategies that we talk about. We call it the 90-10 rule, although I think is more 99.99 and 0.001 rule. But that is that when we start working with this with people, often the frustrations with the system just kind of rolls out. They can't stop it, and they're like, I would be doing this, but the system has got me into this negative functioning, and we say, okay, and this needs to be addressed, and it needs to be worked on for sure. But is there a percentage of it all that you can work on and affect for a more positive situation? And if it's only 0.001%, that's fine. It doesn't have to be the grand solution. But if you can, it has multiple potential positive effects. It gives you more a sense of control, and therefore is going to be a positive deposit. It may actually affect your microenvironment so that the people around you are uplifted to one degree or another. And if that does that, and there's multiple areas, just as you're talking about, now you've got a ripples in a pond effect where, they all begin to start to merge. And we know in physics of wave science, when waves meet each other, often they, increase the amplitude. And therefore, little things can go a long way. And then in the modern age, of course, you start seeing things that work. If you get on a podcast, or you make your own podcast, or you write about it, and you for all you may be able to affect the system more as a whole than you think you can. So I think that's another big one. Then you also mentioned this idea that we can shift into this almost more of a survival mode. And, we consider it the fight or flight components of our brain, the networks in our brain that are more designed to get us out of, real mortal danger. There are old networks there in our brain that we use to get away from saber-toothed tigers and stuff. Well back in prehistory. Well, that's all still there. And we know that repeated stressors, constant stress, big stress will literally strengthen those networks in our brain. They will magnify those networks in our brain, routed into things or parts of the brain like the amygdala, which is the big emotional center, particularly for fear and anger. And will juice up those components of our brain, literally increase the connections going on in there. You can, if you do functional MRIs, you can actually see growth of these regions. And it tends to downregulate our more cognitive areas, because what it's telling us is if we're in big trouble, we don't need a lot of high thought and processing. We just need to get out of trouble. So it will kind of shut down our prefrontal areas of our brain and focus more on these fight or flight components of our brain. And so if, even in this comfortable world that we all live in, where most of us are able to get food on the table and have, clothing and housing and that sort of thing. Our work, what we do at work, or our home life might shift us more into these stages, and they're not pleasant networks to be in all the time. We do much better when we're in the higher cognitive reward center areas of our brain. So I think it is easy to be put into those situations, and some of it is definitely out of our control, but some of it, I think, we're willing participants. And where you're talking about, taking a few minutes, being a little bit mindful and thinking about how we're managing these, how we're responding. Is there a different response that we can use or employ, may go a long way. And then finally, one other thing I was going to say is, I know you and I talked beforehand, and you are comfortable in a more solitary situation at times. I tend to be, I don't know, I fluctuate between the two. Sometimes I need to be hypersocial, sometimes I need to be withdrawn. But one way or the other, we're still social creatures to one degree or another. And in trying to tackle burnout and just in general tackle our stressors, there can be strength in numbers, and there can be a lot to be gained if you can find kind of a trusting group of friends. It doesn't have to be, friends or colleagues or whatever. It doesn't have to be some huge group. It could just be a couple of people. It could be a few people. But the ability periodically to be able to discuss these things, everybody do a personality test, and then just discuss what it made you think about. It's amazing if you can truly open up. It's amazing how all of a sudden, somebody will say something and you go, oh my gosh, I never thought of that. That's a great concept. And it's like you and I talking here, and I think with the podcast is what you're doing is you're opening up other channels of thought, other channels of processing. And because we all process differently, because we all experience reality differently, we're going to hear variation, and the variation is potentially very good for us.
Yeah, I guess you can ponder all you want by yourself, but it's the external world that informs you what you are and what you are not.
It helps, at least, right? And as you say, I mean, reading what the great Greek philosophers said is still doing that, right?
They had a different way of thinking about life, for sure. The old texts have a lot to offer to our modern problems, even though we don't think that they had the same problems. But it's still, we haven't evolved further from that time. From a biological sense, the only thing that's evolved is that we outsource a lot of the processes.
Yeah, I'm actually a big Shakespeare fan. And
nice.
it's not going nearly as far back, right? But my argument is there's nothing no human emotion, no motivation, no behavior that he didn't plumb. And we're the same people. I mean, we are the exact same people as he wrote about.
Yeah, it's a series of conflicts that reoccur in different shapes and forms, right? That's also why stories can be retold and still be interesting, because they're the same, but they're just changed to the current circumstances.
We can relate.
Gary, I would love to leave the audience with some practical steps. I know we've talked about a lot of practicality that they can implement, but if you would have to give 3 to 5 little small pieces of advice that people can do straight away, what would they be?
All right. So here we go. And I could give you 70 if you want, but here's some of the big hitters. One of the biggest hitters is very powerful, but you have to be careful of it. And so one of the biggest hitters is to periodically debrief. We already talked about, self-compassion, and self-care. So those are first and foremost. And when we do, by the way, when we do self-compassion and self-care, meaning addressing our stressors and addressing who we are, we've got to afford ourselves kind of a no guilt approach, because I think a lot of us start to feel guilty if we think we start saying, oh, you're just being a raging narcissist if you think about yourself too much. But if you think about yourself some, it's very powerful, and we should do it without ever feeling guilt. So we got to put the guilt card away. But one of the powerful ones, one of the powerful strategies that is a little two-edged is the idea of debriefing stressors. And that's to periodically think about, what are we facing that really seem to be stressing us out? And it's really good if we can discuss it with a trusted, friend, colleague, spouse, to get that other viewpoint and to get it out on the table. You can do it by yourself, but I think it often helps to have another party. And the psychologist will tell you just airing a negative thought helps dissipate it. So you're already going in the right direction. But what we really want for people to do when they discuss their stressors is to consider their responses to the stressors, not really the stressor itself. And what we tend to do if we submerge into stressors too much is we focus on the stressors. And we say, I got in an argument with a colleague today, and I said this, she said that, and I said this, and she said that, and I said this. And then all we're doing is reliving it, which is not healthy, as opposed to, how did I respond? And was my response something that led to, a more constructive outcome, or is it something that, ultimately is negative in its influence, is not bringing me to where I want to be? And you got to cycle back to, well, where do I want to be? Who do I want to be? So, it ties into what we were saying before. And we call those adaptive versus maladaptive responses. But really what we want to focus on is our responses to the stressors. Consider whether they're adaptive or maladaptive. If they're maladaptive, think about, are there other ways that we could have handled this? And that's where other opinions sometimes, and not even opinions, just other thoughts about, handling stressors may go a long way. The psychologist would tell you, you don't want to bury yourself in stressors, though. And they would counter that with, for every stressor, let's counter it with having a whole bunch of uplifts. So another big exercise is the idea of collecting uplifts. And this gets back into neuroscience and brain circuitry and stuff as well, where there's some pretty good studies that show that if you go into your world intentionally, maybe with a piece of paper to write things down on, or use your phone, but if you go into your world and look around as the day goes on and write down 5 uplifts, 5 things that put a smile on your face, made you feel better, raised your positive emotions, whatever. But write them down, take them home. It's nice if you can collect more than 5, but at least get 5 a day. Look at them at night just before you go to bed to kind of remind yourself of them. If you do that for 2 to 3 weeks, you train your brain, and you're probably rewiring in there, but you train your brain to actually notice these things without making yourself. And I think many of us in this modern world, we tune ourselves into looking for negative things. Like in medicine, it was an important thing to do. We had to look for what's going to go wrong. So we trained ourselves to look for everything that could be bad, but forgot to look at what's going on that's good. So anyway, though, there's been good psychological studies that show that if you do this for 2 to 3 weeks, you train your brain to do it, it'll start noticing it itself. And therefore your world takes on a whole different hue, a whole different tone, because positive things are getting in there. And you're saying, oh, that's cool. That's cool. so those are a few of the big hitters. We talked about the 90-10 rule, um, which I think is another very good exercise. One of the biggest critiques of our books was, oh, these are just simple, silly solutions. They're just common sense. And we said, yes, they are common sense. And yet, how many people are practicing them? And if we tried to overcomplicate it, nobody's going to try it. So here's a really simple one, but I'm telling you, this was a crazy effective with my team. So my team was getting into trouble with their behavior on the phone. It felt like, they were doing okay, interfacing with, people when it was face to face. But when they would get on the phone, their ids would come out. They would be sarcastic and snappy and angry. Why? Because every phone call was more work, and we were overworked anyway, right? So we made a rule for a couple of weeks that everybody, when you get on the phone, you must force a smile on your face. Just force it. And there are studies that support this, but the idea is it's very hard to be a prick when you're smiling. And it's the feedback we got was tremendous. People came back after a while and they said, hey, it was like night and day. And they all saw it as how other people were reacting to them. The people are much, much nicer now when I talk to them on the phone. And we're like, yeah, probably because you're coming out of the blocks, in better shape. So even something that simple can have a real positive impact. Another thing, again, though, to recognize for any of these strategies, and, you can get online again and look at wellness strategies. And I think they're all very good ideas, but you got to recognize that what works for Peter doesn't work for Paul. So for me, there's a lot of advocates for meditation. Meditation doesn't work a lick for me. It does not work at all. The minute I try, the inner voice starts yammering at me, and I've never been able to shut it up, never been able to go, completely zen unless I'm playing the banjo. So yeah, it's not one of those things that really affects me, but I know it works really well for other people. Another thing is journaling. Journaling is an idea, where you just, it's another one of those exercises that gets you in your own head. So you go home and you write a few things down about the day, write a few things that impacted you one way or the other, positive or negative. And it's a tremendous exercise, again, in getting to know ourselves. So for my entire team, neurosurgeons, neurosurgery residents, PAs, nurses. Anyway, I bought all these lovely little leather-bound journals to give them all and try. And, talked about how we use them and how we do it. And I don't know, in a few weeks, I found most of them in trash bins and stuff. So, they came back and told me, that one didn't work so well. We're already, I don't know, pressed for time or whatever. And we weren't able to find, it just didn't work for us. I'll give you one or two more if you want, or shut up whenever you want. But sure. We found another thing that was interesting for people who are in a work setting, at least a work setting where you're around other people. One of the biggest stressors that kept rising to the surface when we were looking at healthcare workers was loneliness. The complaint was they were lonely. And we're saying, wait a minute, you're amongst nothing but people all day long. Thousands of people in a day, potentially, one person after another person after another person. And we're like, how in the world can you be lonely? And we did some further investigation. So we asked our team, to cite the 3 people that they worked closest with, that they spent hours with every day, more than their spouses usually, right? And then we quizzed them on just some very basic data about those people. Are they married? Do they have kids? What did they do last weekend? And our team came up shockingly limited in what they knew about their closest coworkers. And what we began to recognize is that so much of our interactions when we get out into our work and maybe even into our homes, but so much of our interactions are transactive, right? They're we got to get this job done. So we're exchanging a lot, but it's all about whatever our goal is. We're not exchanging who we are as people, or our concerns or our thoughts or our uplifts or anything. Nothing on a personal level, on a human level, is getting exchanged. It's just all goal oriented. And so to be able to tackle that potentially can change that sphere. So, our homework assignment for everybody was to go out and find some of these details about their closest coworkers. And they came back and said, this was great. Again, it made a huge difference, because not only did I feel better about it, but I could tell they felt better about it. And then they're asking their coworkers the same thing. So that would be another example.
Those are some really great things, and I guess I just want to touch on a few of them.
Sure.
One, meditation. I think we have this misconception that meditation needs to be you sitting still and then you're locked into your brain. I highly disagree with that, and I don't think it's the right mode. Some people thrive with training, sitting down and just focusing on their breath. But that is increasingly difficult for us in this society to do, because we are used to a much faster paced, much more stimulating experience of life. So this is only possible if you're slowly enter into it and you have some time in nature, and then maybe try to do it in one way or another, and you have the capacity to let it ruminate. But I think it's not so much about that, and more about being immersed in one task. So when you were operating and you were fully immersed in it and fully concentrated, you were already meditating on the thing, because you're crystallizing the essence into the moment and not being distracted, because it has high consequences, and that has already trained your brain to do what it needs to do. So it's not necessary to then sit down, and your brain is just going to do all sorts of things. But you can train that if that's something that you want to achieve for your life. But I'm saying you're already meditating plenty, and you're doing it now with your book and some other things that you're doing in your life for sure. Playing the banjo, playing the guitar, very meditative if you're doing it the right way. It's about how you do things, not what you do.
And I do agree, by the way, Kevin, although I went to a lot of those meditation seminars.
Sometimes you need to find out by doing it and then ticking off the box. Another thing is journaling is often very difficult for people that are not used to writing by hand, especially in today. So if you want it, we talked about talking to a therapist, talking to a friend, talking to someone, right? You can do it in whatever shape or form you want to do. The task of formulating yourself, either on paper, through a keyboard, through talking to someone, through interacting with a psychologist, I do it. I have a smartwatch, and then I press a record button and it transcribes everything for me. So the formulating, the talking on a podcast is one I do it as well, where I'm reflecting. We've already touched upon this, so it doesn't necessarily need to be that you need to do it with a pen and paper, even though the connection to the brain and doing it with the hand has very beneficial thing. But if you're not getting yourself to do it, then it's better to just do it in a different way.
Yeah, I should have given them all computers, I guess.
Yeah, a dictation, something that they're already using, dictation device or something. It doesn't really matter, but it needs to be frictionless, and it's the same for all habits that you want to do. With it, the less friction that you have, the better, the more likely you're going to do it, and then increase friction with the things that you're trying to avoid to do. And the last thing that I heard you say is loneliness, even though amongst people. And it ties really well into this being present, meditation. It doesn't need to be sitting down, cross-legged, meditating on a mountainside. Being present, having a conversation is meditation if you do it the right way, if you have the right focus, and if you put the right awareness there. And the more senses you integrate and have awareness towards and are able to maintain it, that is enriching your qualia, your personal experience. And so if you're integrating that into all things in your life, that is when you become a true meditation master. It doesn't need to be sitting down. And that ties into being lonely, because if you're stopping and being aware and asking, even though you have transactional relationships, it's not as much about the content. It's much more about how you interact with the content, because we're deriving value and support networks in all way or form around us. And so if you're realizing what value you're getting from the interactions at work, in your life, with your family, with the objects that you have, and you're putting your attention to it and immersing yourself with all of your senses, that kills loneliness. And that also allows you to know what is around you properly, so you don't feel lonely, because you're isolated, you're overflooded with information, but you're not actually taking it in. So when you become aware and interacting with the world in a different way, that's actually where I think the loneliness stops, because you're like, oh yeah, I'm asking you this question because I listened to you. I heard you say this, then I'm reflecting it to you. And that's what really gets you connected. It's not about knowing that you went to school that way. It's nice. But if you're knowing what makes that person and value that they provide to you and you provide to them, and the connection that you have in whatever form, that makes you feel not lonely. You can stop your loneliness by having a good interaction at the bakery or at the coffee shop, or by having a conflict with someone and actually turning it around and stopping and starting to shift that the person's not the problem, but the problem between you is the problem, because you have conflicting needs. And that's when you start to change that perspective and put awareness there, then it resolves, and there the value can arise even through conflict. And that was my own personal ramble, but I'm hoping that I'm summarizing what you were trying to say, and I'm hoping I'm not adding too many things that you're not agreeing with there.
No, I think it all works very well. I think they absolutely complement each other extremely well. I was just thinking too, for people who are more introverted, you can do exactly what you're talking about with nature as well. I mean, be out on a surfboard in the Pacific, and take in what's going on around you and all the splendor that's going on around you. We talk about people who forest bathe, all the time. That just, I mean, for me, I was stunned when I stopped operating and I was actually out of the operating rooms, how much bird song there is around, and just to be able to sit and soak in the bird song, all that stuff can actually combat a sense of loneliness. I think loneliness may be more when you become disconnected with yourself, and when you can become more connected with yourself and then appreciate whatever is around you. And some people are going to want and need to be around other people more, and some people are going to feel less lonely when they're out in the forest, for sure. Another key point you made, and I think it's really important to drive home for your audience who may be working, against burnout and trying to build their resilience, is that most of the activities, most of the strategies, most of the techniques that you are going to employ to help you with it, it takes upfront energy. In other words, they don't just fall on you and then you get a charge from the battery. You actually have to invest some energy up front, and that can be a problem when you're really energy depleted. And you're going to almost have to, tell yourself, look, this is ultimately, I'm going to gain from this, but man, it's going to be hard at first, because I don't have much energy to give, and you're asking me to do, to do random acts of kindness, let's say. That's another activity, right? Do unsolicited random acts of kindness. Well, it's a tremendous benefit for one's psyche, and it is a big charger to our energy banks, or a big deposit, but that takes some effort up front.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good point to conclude the conversation here. Gary, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been very valuable to me, and I hope it's been valuable to the listeners too. I'm sure they can derive some value from it. Where can people find you? What books would you like people to read? And just whatever else you want to send to the audience.
Well, thanks. And thanks so much. I think it's a great conversation, Kevin. I'm learning a lot. I'm learning that you can articulate these much better than I can. But I think we're coming from the same sphere. So I think, what I want most in why I'm writing books and why I'm, doing this sort of thing is I like discourse. I like discussing this stuff. I learn so much from others. I hope I have a few things to offer, and we don't get that if we don't interact, if we don't discuss these things. And again, we're in a world right now with so much noise. People are yelling what we're supposed to be believing in, as opposed to, as you say, listening to each other. The key is really, to listen with intentionality. Of course, that takes energy too. And gain from the fact that we all come at these things from a slightly different perspective. Go back to neuroscience, and all our brains are wired differently. The big wiring, the big cables, the big wiring is fairly reproduced from one person to another. When you get to the microscopic, it is completely different. And we're not the same people we were just a few days ago. And, in terms of our wiring. Anyway, long story short, I love it when people contact me and say, hey, can we discuss this? Can we get into that? And the easiest thing to do is just go to my website. It is my name, Gary R. Simonds. It's spelled Simonds. So it's GaryRSimonds.com.
Amazing. Thank you, Gary, and all the best to the listeners.
Thanks for checking out this episode of GameWell, the podcast to a thriving future in games. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so that you never miss an episode.